A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Retraining the Mind. Introduction. All learning involves attention and study at some level. This course is a mind training course. Good students assign study periods for themselves. However, since this obvious step has not occurred to you, and since we are cooperating in this, I will make the obvious assignment now.
Bill is better at understanding the need to study the notes than you are, but neither of you realize that many of the problems you keep being faced with may already have been solved there. You do not think of the notes in this way at all. Bill does from time to time, but he generally says it's probably in the notes and doesn't look it up. He believes that, although he reads them over, they cannot really help him until they are complete.
First of all, he cannot be sure of this unless he tries. Second, they would be completed if both of you so willed.
You vaguely know that the course is intended for some sort of preparation. I can only say that you were not prepared.
I was amused when you reminded Bill that he, too, was being prepared for something quite unexpected, and he said he was not at all curious about what it was. This disinterest is very characteristic of him when he is afraid. Interest and fear do not go together, as your respective behavior clearly shows.
Mental retardation is a defense which, like the others except the atonement, can be used on behalf of error or truth, as elected. When it occurs in reality, it is a temporary device agreed on beforehand to check the miscreative abilities of strong but misdirected wills.
It is necessary that this appropriate use of the defense be considered real, because otherwise it cannot serve. The lesson involves not only the individual himself, but also his parents, siblings, and all those who come in close relation with him. The value of the experience depends on the need of each particular learner. The person himself is a poor learner, by definition only as a step toward changing from a bad to a good one.
Mental retardation can also be used as a maladaptive defense if the wrong or attack side is employed. This produces the pseudo-retardation syndrome, which is justly classified as a psychiatric or disturbed level symptom. Both of you do this all the time. Bill acts as if he does not understand even his own special language, let alone mine, and you cannot read at all.
This represents a joint attack on both yourselves and me, because it renders your mind weak and mine incompetent. Remember, this puts you in a truly fearful position. If you cannot understand either your own mind or mine, you do not know what it is really willed. This represents a joint attack on both yourselves and me, because it renders your mind weak and mine incompetent. Remember, this puts you in a truly fearful position. If you cannot understand either your own mind or mine, you do not know what it is really willed. It is thus impossible to avoid conflict, as defined before, because even if you act according to will, you wouldn't know it.
The next part of this course rests too heavily on the earlier part not to require its study. Without this, you will become much too fearful when the unexpected does occur to make constructive use of it. However, as you study the notes, you will see some of the obvious implications unless you still persist in misusing the defense of mental retardation. Please remember that its constructive use described above is hardly a real part of your own real proper equipment. It is a particularly inappropriate defense as you use it, and I can only urge you to avoid it.
The reason why a solid foundation is necessary at this point is because of the highly likely confusion of fearful and awesome, which most people do make. You will remember that we said once before that awe is inappropriate in connection with the sons of God, because you should not experience awe in the presence of your own equals. But it was emphasized that awe is a proper reaction of the soul in the presence of its creator.
So far, this course has had only indirect resources to God and rarely even refers to him directly. I have repeatedly emphasized that awe is not appropriate in connection with me because of our inherent equality. I have been careful to clarify my own role in the atonement without either over or understating it. I have tried to do exactly the same things in connection with yours.
The next step, however, does involve the direct approach to God himself. It would be most unwise to start on this step at all without very careful preparation, or awe will surely be confused with fear, and the experience will be more traumatic than beatific.
Healing is of God in the end. The means are carefully explained in the notes. Revelation has occasionally shown you the end, but to reach it, the means are needed.
The following introduction dictated by Helen without notes. The following is the only detailed description which need be written down as to how error interferes with preparation. The events specifically referred to here could be any events, nor does their particular influence matter. It is the process which is to be noted here and not its results. The kind of beliefs in the fallacious premises involves a misthought are as well exemplified here as elsewhere. There is nothing of special interest about the events described below except their typical nature. If this is a true course in mind training, then the whole value of this section rests only in showing you what not to do. The more constructive emphasis is, of course, on the positive approach. Mind watching would have prevented any of this from occurring, and will do so anytime you permit it to.
Following is from notes. Tell Bill that the reason why he was so strained yesterday is because he allowed himself a number of fear-producing attitudes. They were fleeting enough to be more will-o'-the-wisps than serious will errors. But unless he watches this kind of thing, he will find the notes fearful, and knowing him well, will misdistantiate. His unprovoked irritation was unpardonable except by himself, and he did not choose to pardon it. You did, but I am afraid you were under some strain in doing so. This was unfortunate and weakened your own ability to behave healingly towards Bill at the time, and later also towards Lewis, both of whom did act stupidly. But one stupidity at a time is usually enough. You are getting too close to the misuse of mental retardation when stupidity sets in all around.
Having already weakened himself, was very unmiracle-minded, first by not asking Dora if she wanted a lift in the cab, which was going her way. Even if she didn't want it, she would have been able to use the thought well. There's probably no human error that is more fear-provoking in the will-behavior conflict sense than encountering any form of error with error. The result can be highly inflammable. By reacting to Dora's stupidity with his own, All of the elements which are virtually certain to engender fear have been provided.
Bill should note that this is one of the few times that he had to wait for a cab. He thought he took care of it by holding the door of a cab, which did come for that lady, but he was misguided in this belief. Beliefs are thoughts and thus come under Christ guidance, not control. Actually, by giving this cab to her, he was very unkind to you. It was quite apparent that you were extremely cold and also very late. The idea that giving her the cab would atone for his previous errors was singularly out of place and well calculated to lead to future error. If, instead of attempting to atone on his own, he had asked for guidance, there would have been no difficulty whatever in the cab situation. It was not necessary that anyone wait at all.
Bill's original slight to Dora, because of his own need to get home as he perceived it, stopped him from benefiting from the time-saving device of the miracle. He would have gotten home much quicker if he had taken time to use time properly.
You were still suffering from strain and got quite irritated at the girl who stood next to the door on the side, which blocked its opening. Her presence there made it necessary each time the door was opened to hold it for a much longer time than was necessary, and you were angry because this made you cold. Actually, the girl was taking care of the younger child who was standing outside, and both of them were really mentally retarded. If you will remember, the older girl asked you very uncertainly about the bus, and you were well aware at the time of her extreme uncertainty.
It would have been much wiser had you built up her confidence instead of associating with her stupidity. This reduced your own efficiency, and the only thing that saved you then was that you did remember in the cab to ask me about the notes, instead of assuming that you were necessarily to arrange to meet the next day and go over them. Bill had already become so misguided that it did not occur to him that his own will, which he justified by the contents of the recent notes, a misuse of truth only seemingly on its own behalf, might be questionable. You took poor notes yourself here because you got mad at him on remembering this, while you did try to will write in the cab. You did not quite succeed. The error is showing up now.
Bill thus placed himself in a condition to experience a fear rather than a love reaction. Helen notes that she was going to write an excellent position, but did not do so. Answer: you were right about the misuse of excellent here, and please do cross it out. You are still angry. An excellent position for miscreation is not a meaningful approach to the problem.
It was discourteous. Indeed, is not necessary. It was your own error here. I am not saying this with any harsh overtones at all. I'm just trying to create better learning conditions for the study periods. We wanted as little interference as possible for very good reasons.
Now go back to Bill. He was discourteous when he told you that he wanted to keep the original copy of the notes, having decided to have them Xeroxed on his own will, and then justifying it by a very slight misinterpretation of what I said about useful for others. In fact, if you will reread the actual quote, he will see that it really means useful for him. You had interpreted it that way, and frankly, this was pretty clear to me at the time. But this sort of thing happens all the time. It should be noted, however, that the result was not only considerable and totally unnecessary planning on Bill's part, but also a failure to utilize what was intended for him as a help for himself. And before you get too self-satisfied, I would remind you that you do it all the time too.
Bill acted inappropriately toward you by saying that he wanted to be sure that the original was not lost or dirty. It is noticeable that, having already decided what he wanted to do, it never occurred to him that it is possible that he might lose or dirty them himself, especially as he had not entrusted them to me. This is a form of arrogance that he would be much happier without. He should also note that this would probably not have occurred had he not already literally been off the beam. Be sure to tell him that this pun is to reassure him that I am not angry. If he does not get it or does not like it, I know it is not very good. The reason is that he put me in a position where I can really give him very little at the moment.
But I want him to know that I am very well aware of the exceedingly few times he now makes errors of this kind. He has come a very long way in this respect. It seems a shame that he should allow himself even this much discomfort from it.
I suggest to you that we pray for him, and I pray for your full cooperation in this. This will correct your errors and help him react better to the work on the bookcase, which may otherwise lend itself for misuse by misprojection. There would have been no problem at all about the bookcase, and perhaps even no bookcase, if the solution of the storage problem had been left to me. I have promised to guide you out of problems and will certainly not create them for you. But this means that you do not undertake to solve them yourselves. A storage problem is hardly more difficult for me to solve than a space problem. See comments on the special principles for miracle workers.
You started well in your attempt to pray with me for Bill, but ended badly. This is because you had already made a number of earlier errors. You were wrong to be pleased with Bill F's criticism of Rose and should not have enjoyed Bill F's description of Zanville's caricature of her. You could have laughed with Bill, but not at Rose. Real courtesy never does this. You should know that all God's children are fully worthy of complete courtesy. You should never join with one at the expense of another.
When you called Bill about joining you, Jean and Anne, at lunch, you should have waited to ask me. In fact, you should not even have told Anne that you would call. Then you could have asked Bill first if he would want to come and called Anne back. It is true that it was better that he came, but this has nothing to do with the real issue. There are ways of treating others in which only consistent courtesy, even very little things, is offered. This is a very healing habit to acquire.
Bill's answer to your call was a clear statement of his own sadly conflicted state. He said, I don't want to join you, but that's ungracious, so I'll go. Whenever any invitation to join others in a gracious way is offered, it should always be met with respect, although it need not always be accepted. However, if it is met ungraciously, the resulting feeling may well be one of coercion. This is always a split will reaction.
Bill did not solve this by acting graciously. The lunch need not have entailed either mental or physical strain for him, and no need to escape should have arisen. This was a regression of the unprofitable kind, Bill will continue to experience this need from time to time until he is willing to realize that there is nothing he needs or wants to escape from.
It is very hard to get out of the chain of miscreation which can arise out of even the simplest misthought. To borrow one of your own phrases, this kind of human tragedy is far easier to avert than to undo.
You must both learn not to let this kind of chain reaction start. You will not be able to control it once it has started, because everything and everyone will be pulled into the misprojection and misinterpreted accordingly. Nothing is lovely to the unloving. This is because they are creating ugliness.
You, Helen, were definitely not acting right-mindedly by writing these notes right in front of Jonathan. Note that you wrote his name as Jonathan this time, although previously in these same notes you referred to him as Lewis, intentionally using his real name. Actually, of course, it does not matter what you call him, but note that you felt free at the time to choose the name you preferred to use. This time, you were forced to call him Jonathan because you were attacking him when you took the notes in front of him and are now falling back on the magical device of protecting his name.
I had been considering calling Bill rather ambivalently and had gotten up to do so, but remembered to ask. The answer was to call him at 8:30. It would be better if he called, but he may not decide to do so. If he does not, you should try to get through. And if he has decided not to be there, just leave a message that it is not important. This is still a kindly gesture, and the message should be put in a gentle way. Bill did call Helen.
Without going into further elaboration, and we could devote many hours to this, let's consider all the time that we had to waste today, and all the notes that could have been devoted to a better purpose than undoing the waste and thus creating further waste. There is a better use for time too. I would have liked to have spent some time on corrections of the past notes as an important step before reviewing them. A major point of clarification is necessary in connection with the phrase replacing hatred or fear with love.
No, Helen, do not check this against the prayer that Bill very kindly typed for you on the card. That was a gracious offering on his part, and you also accepted it with grace at the time. Why should you deprive yourself of the value of the offering by referring this correction first to him?
These notes did not continue at this time due to the obvious fact that Helen was still clearly not in her right mind. However, Bill later suggested that correct or correct for should be used instead of replace. At the time, he was quite sure about this, and he was perfectly right. The reason why it was essential that he make this correction was that the word replace was his choice originally and reflected a temporary misunderstanding of his own. It was, however, both courteous and necessary that he changed this himself, both as a sign of his own better understanding and of an avoidance of correction by someone else, which would have been discourteous.
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, Complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Special Principles for Miracle Workers. The miracle abolishes the need for lower order concerns. Since it is an illogical or out of pattern time interval by definition, the ordinary considerations of time and space do not apply.
For example, I do not regard time as you and Bill do, and Kolb's space problem is not mine. When you perform a miracle, I will arrange both time and space to adjust to it.
Clear distinction between what has been created and what is being created is essential. All forms of correction or healing rest on this fundamental correction in level perception.
Another way of stating too is never confuse right with wrong-mindedness. Responding to any form of miscreation with anything except a desire to heal or a miracle is an expression of this confusion.
The miracle is always a denial of this error, an affirmation of the truth. Only right-mindedness can create in a way that has any real effect. Pragmatically, what has no real effect has no real existence. Its real effect, then, is emptiness. Being without substantial content, it lends itself to projection.
The level adjustment power of the miracle creates the right perception for healing. Until this has occurred, healing cannot be understood. Forgiveness is an empty gesture unless it entails correction. Without this, it is essentially judgmental rather than healing.
Miraculous forgiveness is only correction. It has no element of judgment at all. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. In no way evaluates what they do. It is strictly limited to an appeal to God to heal their minds. There is no reference to the outcome of their misthought. This does not matter.
The biblical injunction, be of one mind, is the statement for revelation readiness. My own injunction, do this in remembrance of me, is the request for cooperation in miracle workers. It should be noted that the two statements are not in the same order of reality, because the latter involves a time awareness, since memory implies recalling the past in the present.
Time is under my direction, but timelessness belongs to God alone. In time, we exist for and with each other. In timelessness, we coexist with God. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section Atonement without Sacrifice. There's one more point which must be perfectly clear before any residual fear, which may still be associated with miracles, becomes entirely groundless. The crucifixion did not establish the atonement. The resurrection did. This is a point which many very sincere Christians have misunderstood. Nobody who was free of the scarcity fallacy could possibly have made this mistake.
If the crucifixion is seen from an upside-down point of view, it certainly does appear as if God permitted and even encouraged one of his sons to suffer because he was good. Many devoted ministers preach this every day. This particularly unfortunate interpretation, which actually arose out of the combined misprojection of a large number of my own would-be followers, has led many people to be bitterly afraid of God.
This particularly anti-religious concept happens to enter into many religions, and this is neither by chance nor coincidence.
The real Christian would have to pause and ask, how could this be? Is it likely that God himself would be capable of the kind of thinking which his own words have clearly stated is unworthy of man?
There are times when the best defense, as always, is not to attack another's position, but rather to protect the truth. It is not necessary to consider anything acceptable if you have to turn the whole frame of reference around in order to justify it. This procedure is painful in its minor applications and genuinely tragic on a mass basis. Persecution is a frequent result, justifying the terrible misperception that God himself persecuted his own Son on behalf of salvation. The very words are meaningless.
It has always been particularly difficult to overcome this because, although the error itself is no harder to overcome than any other error, men were unwilling to give it up because of its prominent escape value. In milder forms, a parent says, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," and feels exonerated in beating a child. Can you believe that the father really thinks this way?
It is so essential that all such thinking be dispelled, that we must be very sure that nothing of this kind remains in our mind. I was not punished because you were bad. The holy benign lesson which the Atonement teaches is wholly lost if it is tainted with this kind of distortion in any form.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, is strictly a karmic viewpoint. It is a real misperception of truth by which man assigns his own evil past to God. The evil conscience from the past has nothing to do with God. He did not create it and he does not maintain it. God does not believe in karmic retribution at all. His divine mind does not create that way. He does not hold the evil deeds of a man even against himself. It is likely then that we would hold against any man the evil that another did.
Be very sure that you recognize how impossible this assumption really is and how entirely it arises from misprojection. This kind of error is responsible for a host of related fallacies, including the misbelief that God rejected man and forced him out of the Garden of Eden, or that I am misdirecting you. I have made every effort to use words which are almost impossible to distort, but man is very inventive when it comes to twisting symbols around.
God himself is not symbolic, he is fact. The atonement, too, is totally without symbolism. It's perfectly clear because it exists in light. Only man's attempts to shroud it in darkness have made it inaccessible to the unwilling and ambiguous to the partly willing. The atonement itself radiates nothing but truth. It therefore epitomizes harmlessness and sheds only blessing. It could not do this if it arose from anything other than perfect innocence. Innocence is wisdom because it is unaware of evil which does not exist. It is, however, perfectly aware of everything that is true.
The resurrection demonstrated that nothing can destroy truth. Good can withstand any form of evil because light abolishes all forms of darkness. The atonement is thus the perfect lesson. It is the final demonstration that all of the other lessons which I taught are true.
Man is released from all errors if he believes in this. The deductive approach to teaching accepts the generalization which is applicable to all single instances, rather than building up the generalization after analyzing numerous single instances separately. If you can accept the one generalization now, there will be no need to learn from many smaller lessons.
Nothing can prevail against the Son of God, who commands his spirit into the hands of his Father. By doing this, the mind awakens from its sleep, and the soul remembers its Creator. All sense of separation disappears, and level confusion vanishes. The Son of God is part of the Holy Trinity, but the Trinity itself is one. There is no confusion within its levels, because they are of one mind and one will. The single purpose creates perfect integration and establishes the reign of the peace of God.
But this vision can be perceived only by the truly innocent. Because their hearts are pure, they defend true perception instead of defending themselves against it. Understanding the lesson of the atonement, they are without the will to attack, and therefore they see truly. This is what the Bible means when it says, "And when he shall prosper or be perceived, we shall be like him, or we shall see him as he is."
Sacrifice is a notion totally unknown to God. It arises solely from fear of the records. This is particularly unfortunate because frightened people are apt to be vicious. Sacrificing others in any way is a clear-cut violation of God's own injunction that man should be merciful, even as his Father in heaven is merciful.
It has been harder for many Christians to realize that this commandment or assignment also applies to themselves. Good teachers never terrorize their students. To terrorize is to attack, and this results in rejection of what the teacher offers. This results in learning failures.
I've been correctly referred to in the Bible as the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. Those who represent the lamb as blood-stained, an all too widespread conceptual error, do not understand the meaning of the symbol.
Correctly understood, the symbol is a very simple parable or teaching device which merely depicts my innocence. The lion and the lamb lying down together refers to the fact that strength and innocence are not in conflict, but naturally live in peace. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, is another way of saying the same thing. Only the innocent can see God.
There has been some controversy in human terms as to whether seeing in an attribute of the eyes or an expression of the integrative power of the brain. Correctly understood, the issue revolves around the question of whether the body or the mind can see or understand. This is not really open to question at all.
The body is not capable of understanding. Only the mind knows anything. A pure mind knows the truth, and this is its strength. It cannot attack the body because it knows exactly what the body is. This is what a sane mind in a sane body really means.
A sane mind is not out for blood. It does not confuse destruction with innocence, because it associates innocence with strength, not with weakness. Innocence is incapable of sacrificing anything because the innocent mind has everything and strives only to protect its wholeness. This is why it cannot misproject. It can only honor man because honor is the natural greeting of the truly loved to others who are like them.
The Lamb taketh away the sins of the world only in the sense that the state of innocence or grace is one in which the meaning of the atonement is perfectly apparent. The innocence of God is the true state of the mind of his Son. In this state, man's mind does see God, and because he sees him as he is, he knows that the atonement, not sacrifice, is the only appropriate gift to his own altar, where nothing except perfection truly belongs. The understanding of the innocent is truth. That is why their altars are truly radiant.
Dictated directly without notes. Though Christians generally, but by no means universally, recognize the contradiction involved in victimizing others, they are less adept at ensuring their own inability to victimize themselves, although this appears to be a much more benign error from the viewpoint of society. It is nevertheless inherently dangerous because once a two-edged defense is used, its direction cannot be self-controlled.
Bill recently observed how many ideas were condensed into relatively few pages here. This is because we have not been forced to dispel miscreations throughout. There is one set of notes not yet transcribed, which is devoted to this. These emphasize only the enormous waste of time that is involved. Casey's notes, too, could have been much shortened. Their excessive length is due to two factors. The first involves a fundamental error which Casey himself made and which required constant undoing. The second is more related to the attitude of his followers. They are unwilling to admit anything he said. This is respectful enough, but not overly judacious. I would be a far better editor if they would allow me this position on their staff.
It is obvious that Casey himself was not able to transcend the misperceptions of the need for sacrifice, or he could not possibly have been willing to sacrifice himself. Anyone who is unable to leave the requests of others unanswered has not entirely transcended egocentricity. I never gave of myself in this inappropriate way, nor would I ever have encouraged Casey to do so.
Casey and his devotion to me are in no way underestimated by the realization that he worked under very great strain, which is always a sign that something is wrong. One of the difficulties inherent in trance states is that it is very difficult to overcome the split which the trance itself induces through the medium of communications made while in the trance state.
Casey's whole approach put him in a real double bind, from which he did not recover. When he spoke of a dream in which he saw his own rather imminent reincarnation, he was perfectly accurate. He was sufficiently attuned to real communication to make it easy to correct his errors and free him to communicate without strain. It is noticeable throughout his notes that he frequently engaged in a fallacy that we have already noted in some detail, namely, the tendency to endow the physical with non-physical properties. Casey suffered greatly from this error. He did not make either of the other three. However, you will remember that it is this one which is particularly vulnerable to magical associations. Casey's accuracy was so great that even when he did this, he was able to apply it constructively. But it does not follow that this was a genuinely constructive approach.
It should also be noted that when Casey attempted to see the body in proper perspective, he saw physically discernible auras surrounding it. This is a curious compromise, in which the non-physical attributes of the self are approached as if they could be seen with the physical eye.
Casey's illiteracy never stood in his way. This is because illiteracy does not necessarily imply any lack of love, and in Casey's case, very definitely did not. He therefore had no difficulty at all in overcoming his seeming limitation. What did hamper him was a profound sense of personal unworthiness, which, characteristically enough, was sometimes overcompensated for in what might be called a Christian form of grandiosity. Casey was essentially uncharitable to himself. This made him very erratic in his own miracles and, because he was genuinely anxious to help others, left himself in a highly vulnerable position.
His son comments both on the rather erratic nature of the Casey household and also on the rather uneven nature of Casey's temper. Both of these observations are true and clearly point to the fact that Casey did not apply the peace of God to himself. Once this had occurred, particularly in a man whose communication channels were open, it was virtually impossible for him to escape external solutions. Casey was a very religious man who should have been able to escape fear through religion. Being unable to apply his religion wholeheartedly to himself, he was forced to accept certain magical beliefs which were alien to his own Christianity. This is why he was so different when he was asleep and even disowned what he said in this state.
The lack of integration which this split state implies is clearly shown in certain off-the-mark detours into areas such as effects of stones on the mind and some curious symbol attempt to integrate churches and glands. This is hardly more peculiar than some of your own confusion.
Casey's mind was imprisoned to some extent by an error against which you have been cautioned several times. He looked to the past for an explanation of the present, but he never succeeded in separating the past from the present. When he said, mind is the builder, he did not realize that it is only what it is building now that really creates the future. The past in itself does not have the ability to do this. Whenever we move from one instant to the next, the previous one no longer exists. In considering the body as the focus for healing, Casey was expressing his own failure to accept this as accomplished. He did not fail to recognize the value of the atonement for others, but he did fail to accept its corrective merit for himself.
As we have frequently emphasized, man cannot control his own errors. Having created them, he does believe in them. Because of his failure to accept his own perfect freedom from the past, Casey could not really perceive others as similarly free. This is why I have not wholly endorsed the Casey documents for widespread use.
I am heartily supportive of the R's endeavor to make Casey's singular contributions immortal, but it would be most unwise to have them promulgated as a faith until they have been purged of their essential errors. This is why there have been a number of unexplained setbacks in their explication. It is also one of the many reasons why the Casey material, a major step in the speed up, must be properly understood before it can be meaningfully validated.
Casey's son has been wise in attempting to deal with reliability, which in Casey's case is very high. There's a way of validating the material, and Huge Lin is perfectly aware that this must be done eventually. He is also aware of the fact that he is unable to do it. In the present state of the material, it would be most unwise even to attempt it. There's too much that is invalid. When the time comes that this can be corrected to the point of real safety, I assure you it will be accomplished. In tribute to Casey, I remind you that no effort is wasted, and Casey's effort was very great. It would be most ungrateful of me if I allowed his work to produce a generation of witch doctors. I'm sorry that Casey himself could not rid himself of a slight tendency in this direction, but fortunately I have fuller appreciation of him than he had. I am repeating here a biblical injunction of my own, already mentioned elsewhere, that if my followers eat any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. This is what Casey could not believe, because he could not see that, as a son of God, he was invulnerable. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section D. Miracles as accurate perception. Notes not present in the notes. Dictated without notes. We have repeatedly stated that the basic concepts referred to throughout the notes are not matters of degree. Certain fundamental concepts cannot be meaningfully understood in terms of coexisting polarities. It is impossible to conceive of light and darkness or everything and nothing as joint possibilities. They are all true or false. It is absolutely essential that you understand completely that behavior is erratic until a firm commitment to one or the other is made.
A firm commitment to darkness or nothingness is impossible. Nobody has ever lived who has not experienced some light and some of everything. This has made everybody really unable to deny truth totally, even if he deceives himself in this connection most of the time. That is why those who live largely in darkness and emptiness never find any lasting solace. This really answers Bill's question about whether people return voluntarily.
Innocence is also not a partial attribute. It is not a real defense until it is total. When it's partial, it is characterized by the same erratic nature that holds for other two-edged defenses. The partially innocent are apt to be quite stupid at times. And it is not until their innocence is a genuine viewpoint, which is universal in its application, that it becomes wisdom.
Innocent or true perception means that you never misperceive and always see truly. More simply, this means that you never see what does not exist in reality. Whenever you lack confidence in what someone else will do, you are attesting to your belief that he is not in his right mind. This is hardly a miracle-based frame of reference. It also has the disastrous effect of denying, in correct use, the essentially creative power of the miracle. The miracle perceives everything as it is. If nothing but the truth exists, and this is really redundant in statement because what is not true cannot exist, right-minded seeing cannot see anything but perfection. We have said many times that only what God creates or what man creates with the same will has any real existence. This then is all that the innocent can see. They do not suffer from the delusion of the separated ones.
The way to correct all such delusions is to withdraw your faith from them and invest it only in what is true. To whatever extent you side with false perception in yourself or others, you are validating a basic misperception. You cannot validate the invalid. I would suggest that you voluntarily give up all attempts to do so, because they can be only frantic. If you are willing to validate what is true in everything you perceive, you will make it true for you.
Remember that we said that truth overcomes all error. This means that if you perceive truly, you are cancelling out misperceptions in yourself and others simultaneously. Because you see them as they were really created and can really create, you offer them your own validation of their truth. This is the real healing which the miracle actively creates.
Reply to Helen's question, is this all? The reason why this is so short, despite its extreme importance, is because it is not symbolic. This means that it is not open to more than one interpretation. This means that it is unequivocal. It also explains the quotation, which you have never gotten correctly in complete form before. But this we know, that when he shall appear, or be perceived, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that has this hope in him purified himself, even as he is pure. Every man does have the hope that he can see correctly, because the ability to do so is in him. Only man's only hope is to see things as they are. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition. Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section E, Perception versus Knowledge. Notes 328, 5, 177. On Wednesday evening, November 24th, Helen had sudden flash of illumination and very much wanted to offer prayer for Bill, which she did as follows. Jesus, help me see my brother Bill as he really is, and thus release both him and me. Helen also thought later, every time there's anything unlovable that crosses one's mind regarding sex, possession, etc., you should immediately recognize that what you do not want is to hurt your brother. On Thursday morning, the prayer for the miracle occurred as follows, stated above.
You had a lot of trouble afterwards with the words, which are essentially irrelevant, partly because you were dissatisfied with yourself at the time, but also because you are confused about the difference between perception and cognition. You will note that we have said very little about cognition as yet. Aside, one of the exceptions is in the correction formula for fear, which begins with know first. The reason is because you must get your perception straight-ended out before you can know anything.
To know is to be certain. Uncertainty merely means that you don't know. Knowledge is power because it is certain, and certainty is strength. Perception is temporary. It is an attribute of the space-time belief, and is therefore subject to fear or love. Misperception produces fear, and true perception produces love. Neither produces certainty, because all perceptions varies. That is why it is not knowledge. True perception is the basis for knowledge, but knowing is the affirmation of truth.
All of your difficulties ultimately stem from the fact that you do not recognize or know yourselves, each other, or God. Recognize means know again. This means that you knew before. Note what it does not mean saw before. You can see in my ways because perception involves different interpretations, and this means it is not whole. The miracle is a way of perceiving, not a way of knowing. It is the right answer to a question, but you do not ask questions at all when you know.
Questioning delusions is the first step in undoing them. The miracle or the right answer corrects them. Since perceptions change, their dependence on time is obvious. They are subject to transitory states, and this implies variability by definition. How do you perceive at any given time determines what you do, and action must occur in time. Knowledge is timeless because certainty is not questionable. You know when you have ceased to ask questions.
The questioning mind perceives itself in time and therefore looks for future answers. The unquestioning mind is closed merely because it believes the future and the present will be the same. This establishes an unchanged state or stasis. This is usually an attempt to counteract an underlying fear for the future will be worse than the present, and this fear inhibits the tendency to question at all.
Visions are the natural perception of the spiritual eye, but they are still corrections. Bill's question about the spiritual eye was a very legitimate one. The spiritual eye is symbolic and therefore not a device for knowing. It is, however, a means of right perception, which brings it into proper domain of the miracle, but not of revelation. Properly speaking, a vision of God is a miracle rather than a revelation. The fact that perception is involved at all removes the experience from the realm of knowledge. That is why these visions do not last.
The Bible instructs you to know thyself or be certain. Certainty is always of God. When you love someone, you have perceived him as he is, and this makes it possible for you to know him. But it is not until you recognize him that you will know him. Only then are you able to stop asking questions about him.
While you ask questions about God, you are clearly implying that you do not know him. Certainty does not require action. When you say you are acting on the basis of sure knowledge, you are really confusing perception and cognition. Knowledge brings mental strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing.
Perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. Knowledge is a result of revelation and induces only thought, thinking. Perception involves the body even in its most spiritualized form. Knowledge comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. To perceive the truth is not the same as knowing it. This is why Bill is having so much trouble in what he calls integrating the notes. His tentative perception is too uncertain for knowledge because knowledge is sure. Your perception is so variable that you swing from sudden but real knowledge to complete cognitive disorganization. This is why Bill is more prone to irritation, while you are more vulnerable to rage. He is consistently below his potential, while you achieve it at times and then swing very wide of the mark.
Actually, these differences do not matter, but I thought you might be glad to learn that you are much better off with different perceptual problems than you would be if you suffered from similar ones. This enables each of you to recognize, and this is the right word here, that the misperceptions of the other are unnecessary. It is because you do not know what to do about it that Bill reacts to yours with irritation, and you respond to his with fury.
I repeat again that if you attack error, you will hurt yourself. You do not recognize each other when you attack. Attack is always made on a stranger. You are making him a stranger by perceiving him so that you cannot know him. It is because you have made him into a stranger that you are afraid of him. Perceive him correctly so that your soul can know him.
Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to his own altars, which he has established in his sons. There he can communicate his certainty, and his knowledge will bring the peace without question.
God is not a stranger to his own sons, and his sons are not strangers to each other. Knowledge preceded both perception and time and will also ultimately replace or correct for them. This is the real meaning of the biblical account of God as Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. It also explains the quotation, "Before Abraham was, I am." Perception can and must be stabilized, but knowledge is stable. Fear God and keep his commandments is a real scribal error. It should read, know God and accept his certainty. This error is why the commandments are all negative, in contrast to Christ's statements about thou shalt love. There are no strangers in his creation. To create as he created, you can create only what you know and accept as yours.
God knows his children with perfect certainty. He created them by knowing them. He recognizes them perfectly. When they do not recognize each other, they do not recognize him. Brothers can misperceive one another, but they rarely maintain that they do not know each other. This is possible only if they maintain that they are not really brothers. The Bible is very specific on this point. A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section F, Conflict and the Ego. Most of the abilities man now possesses are only shadows of his real strengths. The soul knows, loves, creates. These are unequivocal functions. All of the functions of man are equivocal, or open to question or doubt. This is because he can no longer be certain how he will use them. He is therefore incapable of knowledge because he is uncertain. He is also incapable of true loving because he can perceive lovelessly. He cannot create surely because perception deceives and illusions are not pure.
Perception did not exist until the separation had introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. The soul has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels. Wars arise when some regard others as if they were on a different level. All interpersonal conflicts arise from this fallacy. Only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. The levels which man created by the separation are disastrous. They cannot but conflict. This is because one is essentially meaningless to the other. Freud realized this perfectly, and that is why he conceived as forever irreconcilable the different levels of his psyche. They were conflict-prone by definition because they wanted different things and obeyed different principles.
In our picture of the psyche, there's an unconscious level which properly consists only of the miracle ability and should be under my direction, and a conscious level which perceives or is aware of impulses from both the unconscious and the superconscious. These are the sources of the impulses it receives. Consciousness is thus the level of perception, but not of knowledge. Again, to perceive is not to know. In this connection, Casey is more accurate than Freud.
Consciousness was the first split that man introduced into himself. He became a perceiver rather than a creator in the true sense.
Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. Jung was right indeed in insisting that the ego is not the self and that the self should be regarded as an achievement. He did not recognize, a term we now understand, that the achievement was God's. In a sense, the ego was a man-made attempt to perceive himself as he wished, rather than as he is. This is an example of the created-creator confusion we spoke of before. He can only know himself as he is, because that is all he can be sure of. Everything else is open to question.
The ego is the questioning compartment in the post-separation psyche which man created for himself. It is capable of asking valid questions, but not perceiving wholly valid answers because these are cognitive and cannot be perceived. The endless speculation about the meaning of mind has led to considerable confusion because the mind is confused. Only one-mindedness is without confusion. A separate or divided mind must be confused. A divided mind is uncertain by definition. It has to be in conflict because it is out of accord with itself.
Intrapersonal conflict arises from the same basis as interpersonal. One part of the psyche perceives another part as on a different level and does not understand it. This makes the parts strangers to each other without recognition. This is the essence of the fear-prone condition in which attack is always possible.
Man has every reason to feel anxious as he perceives himself. This is why he cannot escape fear until he knows what he did not and can not create himself. He can never make this misperception valid. And when he at last perceives clearly, he is glad he can't. His creation is beyond his own error variance, and this is why he must eventually choose to heal the separation.
Right-mindedness is not to be confused with the knowing mind, because it is applicable only to the right perception. You can be right-minded or wrong-minded, and this is subject to degrees, a fact which clearly demonstrates a lack of association with knowledge. No, Helen, this is perfectly clear, and does follow the previous section. Neither you nor I is at all confused, even in grammar.
The term right-mindedness is properly used as a correction for wrong-mindedness and applies to the state of mind which induces accurate perception. It is miraculous because it heals misperception, and healing is indeed a miracle in view of how man perceives himself. Only the sick need healing. The soul does not need healing, but the mind does.
Freud gave a very graphic but upside-down account of how the divisions of the mind arose from the bottom up. Actually, it is impossible, because the unconscious cannot create the conscious. You cannot create something you can't know. Freud was greatly worried about this, being very bright, though misguided, and attempted to get around it by introducing a number of borderline areas, which merely resulted in fuzziness. This was particularly unfortunate because he was capable of going much higher if he had not been so afraid. This is why he kept pulling the mind down.
The ego did not arise out of the unconscious. A lower order perception cannot create a higher order one, which is the way you perceive the structure of the psyche if you look at it from the bottom up, because it doesn't understand it. But a higher order perception can create a lower order one by understanding it in terms of misperception.
Perception always involves some misuse of will, because it involves the mind in areas of uncertainty. The mind is very active because it has willpower. When it willed the separation, it willed to perceive. Until it chose to do this, it willed only to know. Afterwards, it had to will ambiguously, and the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception.
The ego is as frail as Freud perceived it. The later theorists have tried to introduce a less pessimistic view, but have looked in the wrong direction for their hope. Any attempt to endow the ego with the attributes of the soul is merely confused thinking. Freud was more clear-sighted about this because he knew a bad thing when he perceived it, but he failed to recognize that a bad thing cannot exist. It is therefore wholly unnecessary to try to get out of it. As you very rightly observed yourself, the thing to do with a desert is to leave.
The mind returns itself to its proper function only when it wills to know. This places it in the soul's service, where perception is meaningless. The superconscious is the level of the mind which wills to do this. Freud was particularly distorted on this point because he was getting too far up for comfort according to his own perception. But he was right in maintaining that the parts of the psyche cannot be correctly perceived either as things or as entirely separate. He would have thought better if he had said entirely separated.
The mind did divide itself when it willed to create its own levels and the ability to perceive them, but it could not entirely separate itself from the soul, because it is from the soul that it derives its whole power to create. Even in miscreating, will is affirming its source, or it would merely cease to be. This is impossible because it is part of the soul, which God created and which is therefore eternal.
The ability to perceive made the body possible because you must perceive something and with something. This is why perception involves an exchange or a translation, which knowledge does not need. The interpretive function of perception, actually a distorted form of creation, then permitted man to interpret the body as himself, which, although depressing, was a way out of the conflict he induced. This has already been covered in some detail.
The superconscious, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power because it was incapable of darkness. This is why it became almost inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. It was perceived as a threat because light does abolish darkness by establishing the clear fact that it isn't there. The truth will always destroy error in this sense. This is not an active process of destruction at all. We have already emphasized the fact that knowing does not do anything. It can be perceived as an attacker, but it cannot attack.
What man perceives as its attack is his own recognition of the fact that it can always be remembered, because it has never been destroyed. That is not a literal remembering as much as remembering. That is largely for Bill. I wish he would decide to use that talent of his constructively. He had no idea of how powerful it could be. Actually, it does come from the unconscious, and is really a distorted form of miraculous perception, which he has reduced to word twisting. Although this can be quite funny, it is still a real waste. Maybe he'd care to let me control it, and still use it humorously himself. He doesn't have to decide it. It is one or the other.
The unconscious should never have been reduced to a container for the waste products of conflict. Even as he perceives his psyche, every level has a creative potential because nothing man creates can wholly lose this.
God and the souls he created remain in surety, and therefore know that no miscreation exists. Truth cannot deal with unwilling error, because it does not will to be blocked out. But I was a man who remembered the soul and its knowledge. Tell Bill that when he refused to misperceive, he was indeed behaving as I behaved, and as a man, I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge, so much as to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind, by uniting my will with that of my Creator, which naturally remembered the soul and its own real purpose.
I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. Only your misperceptions stand in your own way. Without them, your own choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. The atonement was an act based on true perception. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice.
Many are called, but few are chosen. Should read. All are called, but few choose to listen. Therefore they do not choose right. The chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner. This is the real meaning of the celestial speed up. Strong wills can do this now, and you will find rest for your souls. God knows you only in peace, and this is your reality.
Note that the term insight, though referring to lofty perception, is not an attribute of knowledge. This is why terms like lofty are meaningless in this context. Insight is not the way to knowledge, but it is a prerequisite for knowledge. Being of God, knowledge has nothing to do with your perceptions at all. That is why it can only be a gift of God to you.
Forgiveness is the healing of the perception of separation. Correct perception of each other is necessary only because minds have willed to see themselves as separate beings. Each soul knows God completely. This is the miraculous power of the soul. The fact that each soul has this power completely, is a fact that is entirely alien to human thinking, in which if anyone has everything, there's nothing left.
God's miracles are as total as his thought because they are his thoughts. God shines in them all with perfect light. If they recognize this light anywhere, they know it universally. Revelation cannot be explained because it is knowledge. Revelation happens. It is the only really natural happening because it reflects the nature of God.
As long as perception lasts, prayer has a place. Since perception rests on lack, those who perceive have not totally accepted the atonement and given over themselves to truth. Perception is a separated state, and the perceiver does need healing. Communion, not prayer, is the natural state of those who know. God and his miracles are inseparable.
All words, at best, are preparatory. The word is really a thought. No one word is universally meaningful because a word is a symbol, but thought is not divisible by creation. The original name for thought and word was the same. The quotation should read, "In the beginning was the thought, and the thought was with God, and the thought was God." How beautiful indeed are the thoughts of God, who live in his light. Your worth is beyond perception because it is beyond doubt.
Do not perceive yourself in different lights. Know yourself in the one light, where the miracle which is you is perfectly clear.
The prerequisites for therapy must include the following conditions.
The procedure must involve the recognition rather than the denial of the importance of thought.
The exact equality of everyone who is involved. This must include me.
No one is either therapist or patient. Bill should add teacher or pupil.
Above all, everyone involved must want to give up everything that is not true. The reason for the negative emphasis here is that therapy implies something has gone wrong. Even though the purpose is to correct, those who are ill are negative.
Therapy is exactly the same as all other forms of miracle working. It has no separate laws of its own. All of the points that were given for miracles apply to therapy, because unless therapy proceeds from miracle-mindedness, it cannot heal.
The therapist, hopefully, does have the role of being the better perceiver. This is also, again, hopefully true of the teacher. It does not follow that he is the better knower. Temporarily, the therapist or teacher can help in straightening out twisted perceptions, which is also the only role that I would ever contribute myself. All therapy should do is try to place everyone involved in the right frame of mind to help one another. It is essentially a process of true courtesy, including courtesy to me.
Any form of mental illness can truthfully be described as an expression of viciousness. We said before that those who are afraid are apt to be vicious. If we were willing to forgive other people's misperceptions of us, they could not possibly affect us at all. There's little doubt that you can explain your present attitudes in terms of how people used to look at you. But there is no wisdom in doing so. In fact, the whole historic approach can justifiably be called doubtful.
As you have so often said, no one has adopted all of his parents' attitudes as his own. In every case, there has been a long process of choice in which the individual has escaped from those he himself vetoed, while retaining those he voted for. Bill has not retained his parents' political beliefs, in spite of the particular kind of newspapers that constituted their own reading matter in this area. The reason why he could do this was because he believed he was free in this area.
There must be some acute problem of his own that would make him so eager to accept their misperception of his own worth. This tendency can always be regarded as punitive. It cannot be justified by the inequality of the strength of parents and children. This is never more than temporary, and is largely a matter of maturational and thus physical difference. It does not last unless it is held on to.
When Bill's father came to his new office and destroyed it, it is quite apparent that Bill must have been willing to let it be destroyed. The many times that he has commented on this event alone would suggest that the extreme importance of this misperception in his own distorted thinking. Why should anyone accord an obvious misperception so much power? There cannot be any real justification for it, because even Bill himself recognized the real problem by saying, "How could he do this to me?" The answer is he didn't.
Bill has a very serious question to ask himself in this connection. We said before that the purpose of the resurrection was to demonstrate that no amount of misperception has any influence at all on the Son of God. This demonstration exonerates those who misperceive by establishing beyond doubt that they have not hurt anyone. Bill's question, which he must ask himself very honestly, is whether he is willing to demonstrate that his parents have not hurt him. Unless he is willing to do this, he has not forgiven them.
The essential goal of therapy is the same as that of knowledge. No one can survive independently as long as he is willing to see himself through the eyes of others. This will always put him in a position where he must see himself in different lights. Parents do not create the image of their children, though they may perceive images which they do create. However, as we have already said, you are not an image. If you side with image makers, you are merely being idolatrous.
Bill has no justification whatever for perpetuating any image of himself at all. He is not an image. Whatever is true of him is wholly benign. It is essential that he know this about himself, but he cannot know it while he chooses to interpret himself as vulnerable enough to be hurt. This is a peculiar kind of arrogance whose narcissistic component is perfectly obvious. It endows the perceiver with sufficient unreal strength to make him over, and then acknowledges the perceiver's miscreation. There are times when this strange lack of real courtesy appears to be a form of humility. Actually, it is never more than simple spite.
Bill, your parents did misperceive you in many ways, but their ability to perceive was quite warped, and their misperceptions stood in the way of their own knowledge. There is no reason why it should stand in the way of yours. It is still true that you believe they did something to you. This belief is extremely dangerous to your perception and wholly destructive to your knowledge. This is not only true of your attitudes towards your parents, but also of your misuse of your friends. You still think that you must respond to their errors as if they were true. By reacting self-destructively, you are giving them approval for their misperceptions.
No one has the right to change himself according to different circumstances. Only his actions are capable of appropriate variation. His belief in himself is a constant, unless it rests on perceptual acuity rather than knowledge of what he is.
It is your duty to establish beyond doubt that you are totally unwilling to side with, identify with, anyone's misperceptions of you, including your own. If you become concerned with totally irrelevant factors, such as the physical condition of a classroom, the number of students, the hours of the course, and the many elements which you may choose to select for emphasis as a basis for misperception, you have lost the knowledge of what any interpersonal relationship is for. It is not true that the difference between pupil and teacher is lasting. They meet in order to abolish the difference. At the beginning, since we are still in time, they come together on the basis of inequality of ability and experience. The aim of the teacher is to give them more of what is temporarily his. This process has all of the miracle conditions we referred to at the beginning. The teacher or miracle worker gives more to those who have less, bringing them closer to equality with him, at the same time gaining for himself.
The confusion here is only because they do not gain the same things, because they do not need the same things. If they did, their respective, though temporary roles would not be conducive to mutual profit. Freedom from fear can be achieved by both teacher and pupil only if they do not compare either their needs of their positions in regard to each other in terms of higher and lower.
Presumably, children must learn from parents. What parents learn from children is merely of a different order. Ultimately, there is no difference in order, but this involves only knowledge. Neither parents nor children can be said to have knowledge, or their relationships would not exist as if they were on different levels. The same is true of the teacher and the pupil. Children have an authority problem only if they believe that their image is influenced by the authority. This is an act of will on their part because they are electing to misperceive the authority and give him this power.
A teacher with an authority problem is merely a pupil who refuses to teach others. He wants to maintain himself in a position where he can be misused and misperceived. This makes him resentful of teaching because of what he insists it has done to him.
The only way out of this particular aspect of the desert is still to leave. The way this is left is to release everyone involved by absolutely refusing to engage in any form of honoring error. Neither teacher nor pupil is imprisoned by learning unless he uses it as an attack. If he does this, he will be imprisoned whether he actually teaches or learns, or refuses to be engaged in the process at all.
The role of a teacher, properly conceived, is one of leading himself and others out of the desert. The value of this role can hardly be underestimated, if only because it was one to which I very gladly dedicated my own life. I have repeatedly asked my pupils to follow me. This means that to be effective teachers, they must interpret teaching as I do. I have made every effort to teach you entirely without fear. If you do not listen, you will be unable to avoid the very obvious error of perceiving teaching as a threat.
It is hardly necessary to say that teaching is a process whose purpose is to produce learning. The ultimate purpose of all learning is to abolish fear. This is necessary so that knowledge can happen. The role of the teacher is not the role of God. This confusion is all too frequently made by parents, teachers, therapists, and the clergy. It is a real misunderstanding of both God and his miracles. Any teacher who believes that teaching is fearful cannot learn because he is paralyzed. He also cannot really teach.
Bill was quite right in maintaining that this course is a prerequisite for his. However, he was really saying much more than that. The purpose of this course is to prepare you for knowledge. So the only real purpose of any legitimate course, all that is required of you as a teacher is to follow me.
Whenever anyone decides that he can function only in some roles but not in others, he cannot but be attempting to make a compromise which will not work. If Bill is under the misbelief that he is coping with the fear problem by functioning as an administrator and as a teacher of interns, but not as a teacher of students, he is merely deceiving himself. He owes himself greater respect. There is nothing as tragic as the attempt to deceive oneself, because it implies that you perceive yourself as so unworthy that deception is more fitting for you than truth. Either you can function in all of the roles you have properly undertaken to fill, or you cannot function effectively in any of them. This is an all or none decision. You cannot make inappropriate level distinctions within this choice. You are either capable or not. This does not mean that you can do everything, but it does mean that you are either totally miracle-minded or not. The decision is open to no compromise whatever. When Bill says that he cannot teach, he is making the same mistake that we spoke of before, when he acted as if universal laws applied to everyone except him. This is not only arrogant, but patently untrue. Universal laws must apply to him unless he does not exist. We will not bother to argue about this.
Descartes engaged in a very interesting teaching procedure. and one from which he himself learned a great deal. He began with doubting the existence of everything except himself. He insisted that his own existence was not open to doubt, and rebuilt the entire thought system on the one premise: I think, therefore I am. It is noteworthy that he arrived at accepting the entire system he originally doubted solely on the basis of this one piece of knowledge. There was, however, a distinct shift in his own perception. He no longer really questioned the reality of what he perceived because he knew he was there.
We mentioned before that Bill is not too sure of this, and that is why we suggested that he concentrate on Lord, here I am. A teacher is unlikely to be effective unless he begins with being there. Bill, this is not really open to question. You will lose all your fear of teaching and relating in any form once you know who you are. There is no point whatever in remaining in the prison of believing that this is up to you. You do not exist in different lights. It is this belief which has confused you about your own reality. Why would you want to remain so obscure to yourself?
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section H, Judgment and the Authority Problem. Notes not present in the notes. We have already discussed the Last Judgment in some, though insufficient, detail. After the Last Judgment, there isn't any more. This is symbolic only in the sense that everybody is better off without judgment. When the Bible says, "Judge not, that ye be not judged," it merely means that if you judge the reality of others at all, you will be unable to avoid judging your own. The choice to judge rather than know has been the cause of the loss of peace. Judgment is the process on which perception, but not cognition, rests. We covered this before in terms of selectivity. Evaluation was said at the time to be its obvious prerequisite.
Judgment always involves rejection. It is not an ability which emphasizes only the positive aspects of what is judged, whether it be in or out of the self. However, what has been perceived and rejected or judged and found wanting remains in the unconscious because it has been perceived. Watson had a very relevant notion of the unconscious in this connection. In fact, it was so relevant that he dropped it as officially out of accord with behaviorism. He was right on both counts.
One of the illusions from which human perception suffers is that what it perceives and judges against has no effect. This cannot be true unless man also believes that what his judgments vetoes does not exist. He evidently does not believe this, or he would not have judged against it. It does not really matter, in the end, whether you judge right or wrong. Either way, you are placing your belief in the unreal. This cannot be avoided in any type of judgment because it implies the belief that reality is yours to choose from.
Neither of you has any idea of the tremendous release and deep peace that comes from meeting yourselves and your brothers totally without judgment. If you will look back at the earlier notes about what you and your brothers are, you will realize that judging them in any way is really without meaning. In fact, their meaning is lost to you precisely because you are judging them. All uncertainty comes from a totally fallacious belief that you are under the coercion of judgment. You do not need it to organize your life, and you certainly do not need it to organize yourselves.
When you look upon knowledge, all judgment is automatically suspended, And this is the process that enables recognition to replace perception. Man is very fearful of everything he has perceived and refused to accept. He believes that because he has refused to accept it, he has lost control over it. This is why he sees it in nightmares, or in pleasant disguise, in what seems to be happier dreams. Nothing that you have refused to accept can be brought into awareness. It does not follow that it is dangerous, but it does follow that you have made it dangerous.
When you feel tired, it is merely because you have judged yourself as being capable of being tired. When you laugh at someone, it is because you have judged them as debased. When you laugh at yourself, you're singularly likely to laugh at others, if only because you cannot tolerate being more debased than others. All of this does make you tired because it is essentially disheartening. You are not really capable of being tired, but you are very capable of wearying yourselves.
The strain of constant judgment is virtually intolerable. It is a curious thing that any ability which is so debilitating should be so deeply cherished. But there is a very good reason for this. This, however, depends upon what you mean by good.
If you wish to be the author of reality, which is totally impossible anyway, then you will insist on holding on to judgment. You will also use the term with considerable fear and believe that judgment will someday be used against you. To whatever extent it is used against you, it is due only to your belief in its efficacy as a weapon of defense for your own authority.
The issue of authority is really a question of authorship. When an individual has an authority problem, it is always because he believes he is the author of himself and resents his own projection that you share his delusion in this respect. He then perceives the situation as one in which two people are literally fighting for his own authorship. This is the fundamental error of all those who believe they have usurped the power of God.
The belief is very frightening to them, but hardly troubles God at all. He is, however, eager to undo it, not to punish his children, but only because he knows that it makes them unhappy. Souls were given their own true authorship, and men prefer to remain anonymous when they chose to separate themselves from their author. The word authority has been one of their most fearful symbols ever since. Authority has been used for great cruelty because, being uncertain of their true authorship, men believed that their creation was anonymous. This has left them in a position where it sounds meaningful to consider the possibility that they must have created themselves.
The dispute over authorship has left such uncertainty in the minds of men that some people have gone so far as to doubt whether they were ever created at all. Despite the apparent contradiction in this position, it is in one sense more tenable than the view that they created themselves. At least it acknowledged the fact some true authorship is necessary for existence.
Only those who give over all desire to reject can know that their own rejection is impossible. You have not usurped the power of God, but you have lost it. Fortunately, when you lose something, this does not mean that the something has gone. It merely means that you do not know where it is. Existence does not depend on your ability to identify it or even to place it. It is perfectly possible to look on reality without judgment and merely know it is there. By knowing this, you're not doubting its reality at all.
Peace is a natural heritage of the soul, Everyone is free to refuse to accept his inheritance, but he is not free to establish what his inheritance is. The problem which everyone must decide is the fundamental question of his own authorship. All fear comes ultimately, and sometimes by the way of very devious routes, from the denial of our authorship. The offense is never to God, but only to the denier himself. He has thrown away the reason for his own peace, and sees himself only in pieces. This strange perception is authority problem. It is also the basis for castration anxiety, since both forms of error are fundamentally the same.
Neither you nor Bill can find peace while this authority problem continues. But the truth is still that there is no problem about this. There is no man who does not feel that he is imprisoned in some way. If this has been the result of his own free will, he must regard his will as if it were not free. The obviously circular reasoning of his own position would be quite apparent.
Free will must lead to freedom. Judgment always imprisons because it separates segments of reality according to highly unstable scales of desire. Wishes are not facts by definition. To wish is to imply that willing is not sufficient. However, no one really believes that what is wished is as real as what is willed. Instead of seek you first the kingdom of heaven, say, will ye first the kingdom of heaven? And you have said, I know what I am, and I will to accept my own inheritance.
It is essential that this whole authority problem be voluntarily dismissed at once and for all before Bill's course. Neither of you understands how important this is for your sanity. You're both quite insane on this point. This is not a judgment, it is merely a fact. No, Helen, you should use the word fact. This is just as much a fact as God is. A fact is literally a making or a starting point. You do start from this point, and your thinking is inverted because of it.
A Course in Miracles, Urtext Manuscripts, complete 7-volume combined edition, Volume 1, Chapter 3. I. Creating versus self-image. Every system of thought must have a starting point. It begins with either a making or a creating, a difference which we have already covered. Both are acts of will, except that making involves doing, and creating involves active willing. Their resemblance lies in their power as foundations. Their difference lies in what rests upon them. Both are cornerstones for systems of belief by which men live.
It is a mistake to believe that a thought system which is based on lies is weak. Nothing made by a child of God is without power. It is absolutely essential that you realize this, because otherwise you will not understand why you have so much trouble with this course and will be unable to escape from the prisons you have created for yourselves. The use of creative here was an error. You should have said made for yourself.
You have both made the error of the psychotherapist we described in some detail before, and it is particularly serious at this time. You cannot both make the error of the psychotherapist we described in some detail before, and it is particularly serious at this time. You cannot resolve your authority problem by depreciating the power of your minds. It can hurt you if you misuse it, because you know its strength. You also know that you cannot weaken it any more than you can weaken God.
The devil is a frightening concept only because he is thought of as extremely powerful and extremely active. He is perceived as a force in combat with God, battling him for possession of souls. He deceives by lies and builds kingdoms of his own, in which everything is in direct opposition to God. Yet he attracts men rather than repels them, and they are perceived as willing to sell him their souls in return for gifts they know of no real worth at all.
This makes absolutely no sense. The whole picture is one in which man acts in a way he himself realizes is self-destructive, but which he does not will to correct, and therefore perceives the cause as beyond his control.
We have discussed the fall or separation before, but its meaning must be clearly understood without symbols. The separation is not symbolic. It is an order of reality or a system of thought that is perfectly real in time, though not in eternity. All beliefs are real to the believer.
The fruit of only one tree was forbidden to man in a symbolic garden, but God could not have forbidden it, or it could not have been eaten. If God knows his children, and I assure you he does, would he have put them in a position where their own destruction was possible? The tree which was forbidden was correctly named Tree of Knowledge. Yet God created knowledge and gave it freely to his creations. The symbolism here is open to many interpretations, but you may be sure that any interpretation which perceives either God or his creations as if they were capable of destroying their own purpose is wrong.
Eating of the tree of knowledge is a symbolic expression for incorporating into the self the ability for self-creation. This is the only sense in which God and his souls are not co-creators. The belief that they are is implicit in the self-concept, a concept now made acceptable by its weakness and explained by a tendency of the self to create an image of itself. Its fear aspect is usually ascribed to the father figure, a particularly interesting idea in view of the fact that nobody means the physical father by the term. It refers to an image of a father in relation to an image of the self.
Once again, images are perceived, not known. Knowledge cannot deceive, but perception can. Man can perceive himself as self-creating, but he cannot do more than believe it. He cannot make it true. I told you before that when you finally perceive correctly, you can only be glad you can't. But until then, the belief that you can is the central foundation stone of your thought system. And all your defenses are used to attack ideas which would bring it to light.
You and Bill still believe you are images of your own creation. You are split with your own souls on this point, and there is no resolution because you believe the one thing that is literally inconceivable. That is why you cannot create and are afraid to make or produce.
You, Helen, are constantly arguing about the authorship of this course. This is not humility. It is a real authority problem. And you, Bill, really believe that by teaching you are assuming a dominant or father role and that the father figure will kill you. This is not humility either. Castration fears are a particularly distorted reflection of the real basic anxiety or separation fear.
The mind can make the belief in separation very real and very fearful. And this belief is the devil. It is powerful, active, destructive, and clearly in opposition to God because it literally denies his fatherhood. Never underestimate the power of this denial. Look at your lives and see what the devil has made, but know that this making will surely dissolve in the light of truth because its foundation is a lie.
Your creation by God is the only foundation which cannot be shaken because the light is in it. Your starting point is truth, and you must return to this beginning. Much has been perceived since then, but nothing else has happened. That is why your souls are still in peace, even though your minds are in conflict.
You have not yet gone back far enough, and that is why you become so fearful. As you approach the beginning, you feel the fear of the destruction of your thought systems upon you, as if it were the fear of death. There is no death, but there is a belief in death.
The Bible says that the tree that bears no fruit will be cut off and will wither away. Be glad. The light will shine from the true foundation of life, and your own thought systems will stand corrected. They cannot stand otherwise.
You who fear salvation are willing death. Life and death, light and darkness, knowledge and perception are irreconcilable. To believe that they can be reconciled is to believe that God and man cannot. Only the oneness of knowledge is conflictless. Your kingdom is not of this world because it was given you from beyond this world. Only in this world is the idea of an authority problem meaningful. The world is not left by death, but by truth, and truth can be known by all those for whom the kingdom was created and for whom it waits.
Wow.